All right, folks, before we jump into Unit 6, I wanted to talk about this little posting that's at the very bottom of Unit 5. And this is kind of a little bit of a leftover from our old orientation class where we used to talk about this stuff pretty extensively. One thing that happens as you start to get into this field, you have, this feeling of being overwhelmed, with all this technology stuff. And I get that feeling. What I always try to tell people is don't freak out. Just take it one step at a time. Learn what you can, absorb what you can, and find clever ways to kind of keep things straight. What we have here, this is kind of a list that I put together with Wendy over time, as we are usually the ones that teach, these courses. And there's some sites out there that you might find really helpful. Some we've already showed you, and some sites and tools that you might want to kind of think about a little bit, in terms of how you gather and store information and use stuff. Basically, is really kind of a polite way to say it. Now, when you start out as a web developer, usually most good web teachers will point you to the W3 School site because, arguably it is one of the more important sites that you have out there in terms of information. So if you're not familiar with that one, again, it's just w3schools.com, right? And then they have all these different tutorials on different languages, most notably all the web technologies, so like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and a bunch of other stuff that you'll also learn in your program. So other things you're going to learn in your program aside from HTML, CSS, you'll learn some JavaScript, some jQuery, React, Angular, JSON, a little bit of Ajax. You'll learn some SQL, you'll learn C#, you'll learn Python, you'll learn Java, etc., etc. MongoDB, I'm just looking up Node.js, ASP, PHP. Those are all things that you learn in our program. You also touch upon TypeScript and Django. If you're a data student, you learn R, Python, etc. So, great site, right? But in terms of what happens when you run into coding issues, right? So, a real popular site, by the way, is this site called Stack Overflow. And I'm not necessarily going to click through to it, but usually if you're looking for answers to weird coding questions, you often end up on a Stack Overflow forum answering or addressing really bizarre coding issues, and then the conversations that happen, some of them are polite, some of them not so polite, but Stack Overflow is one of those sites that you do go to where people have basically answers to questions that you might run into, right? So there's the public version and there is a private version, but that's one that you often end up on. So that's usually a pretty good resource, especially for highly technical questions. Then there's this weird site, Free Code Camp, and I don't know if you guys have ever explored this. I do get a lot of students that check them out. And yeah, it's free, you guys, so you can actually do a bunch of training without paying any money. And then you can click through. You can sign in, right? So you have to sign in with the thing. But then once you get inside here, and I'm just going to go with my Google account here, and I'll use my school account. I just want to show you all the different stuff here that you can study, right? And they do upgrade this over time. But if you went into responsive web design, that's basically what we're learning. And they have individual lessons that you can go through, and if you can complete all these lessons, you can earn a certification from them. I'm not really sure how industry valuable that actually is, but kind of a cool site. But then there's also sites where you can get information. So one really good site, if you want to just kind of be in the know, is ZDNet. ZDNet is ZDNet, just so you know who they are, they're one of the biggest publishers of technology publications, stuff you find on the newsstand, but also online content. So really kind of a cool site. Then you can become part of the Microsoft Developers Network if you're really kind of interested about this. And this is an organization that you can join voluntarily. and they have lots of really cool information. It's a little Microsoft focused, but you can get a lot of cool perks out of this too. Like, for example, like early builds of Windows operating systems or software and things like that. If you're curious about what people in this profession make, there's this salary guide. And I think a lot of people come into this going, I can make a lot of money in IT. And it's like, well, true, but it depends on the stuff that you know how to do, right? And the more you know how to do, the more valuable you are. So this is kind of a neat site and tool. And then this is kind of an interesting site too for web developers, because Smashing Magazine really is designed for people like us who, we're the actual people that create the web. So that's what this magazine is geared towards. And you can see, some of the articles that they have. So they have guides. They have really cool articles that are written by people that actually do the work. In some cases, they have examples. I like the way the website's put together and the effects that they have on it. Pretty cool site, by the way. The other thing that happens is you end up getting to this situation, like a lot of us do, where it's so much information is thrown at us all the time. How is it you can possibly keep track of it all? And in other words, how do you curate your content? So these are what we call curation tools. And some of them that you might consider using are sites like Flipboard or Pinterest, or this medium.com, where you can actually gather information and store it for your own personal use. So those are some examples, and those come from Wendy. I'm not necessarily popular or huge enthusiastic about those. I tend to use a couple of other tools. One of them is OneNote, which is built into Microsoft Office. So that's one that you could explore. Another one that I used a lot, especially in the past, was this one called Evernote. And I like this one because that's like a spot where I can gather all my notes in one place. I know the Mac OS has a note-taking tool built in also. And then kind of like maybe one of the last ones I would point out here is that on your Google account, you also have this tool called Keep, which is kind of neat. And that's without really digging into it too deep, it's a place where you can go and you can make these little cards where you drop in usually links and images and information. You can do it on your phone, in a bunch of other platforms too, to just basically kind of gather information and where do you put it when you're online. Like you find a cool link, or you find an article, or you find a couple of really important words. So those are things to look at. The other thing that I always suggest to my students is when you're in the IT field, it really becomes pretty important to keep abreast of what's going on. So find some good news sources. I think the BBC is a really good one. Forbes magazine is a really good one. And then just, basically explore, folks. And then how do you gather that information and store it? That really becomes up to you. Ultimately, when you start getting to the point where you are looking for work, a lot of people will go right directly to job listings, so like they'll go to Monster or Indeed or whatever and look up, jobs for web developers, for example. But that's not always really a successful search, especially if you're brand new to the field. So what a lot of people do is they use what we call job placement firms. So in other words, companies that specialize in getting IT people hired for jobs. And we have a kind of a listing of them here. Some placement firms that people here at Gateway have worked with either directly or indirectly, and with various degrees of success. The one that we've used most often here, and in fact for some time they were part of our advisory board, was Tech Systems, that has locations, I think, in Brookfield and Schaumburg, Illinois. I think those are their closest offices. But they have hired a lot of our students, or placed, is a better way to say it, is placed a lot of our students into careers. But there's a number of companies like that. When I first started out and graduated, with that big, thick portfolio, one thing I did is I went to a firm like this, because I couldn't find a job on my own initially, so I just went to one of them, and what they did is they, within a few days, had me working, and that was really cool. And I in all my experiences doing it, I worked at 2 different places. One was a temporary thing, right, because that happens. And then the other one was a little bit more long term, and they eventually offered me a job. I didn't take it, by the way, because I had landed a different job. But that's kind of what happens: is they get you into companies, the companies like you, and then they just hire you. All right. There's usually a little bit of a fee you have to pay with them, which is a percentage of your pay, or you have to sign up for like a 6-month or a 1-year term where they take a cut of your pay until the contract's up. So, I think it's better to get a job without, but they were able to find me a position ultimately. And so it's sometimes a very good fit for people, because a lot of IT jobs are often not published, by the way. Some companies only use these kind of firms to fill their positions. All right, so that's what I have on that. So I am jumping over to the next unit now, and we're going to dig in to the next 2 chapters of content. So we have 2 chapters to cover in this unit, and I want you to notice we're covering chapter 7 and 8. Chapter 7 does have some coding things in it, and so does chapter 8. I do want you to notice when you look at the assignments here that there's a separate chapter 7 and then a separate chapter 8 in this unit. If I remember right, the due dates are staggered on those, but there's also in the mix here an improve your website. So whatever you did in unit 5 on your site building assignment, you have a generic open call here to improve it, in thinking that you would do 2 things. So one thing that you would do is add a table, which we're going to show you in chapter 8. And then you can also just add more CSS and some of the tricks that we're going to learn along the way. But those are the assignments here in this unit. All right, so let's dig into chapter 7. I'm going to pull up the slideshow, and we'll get into the material here. All right, so here's the content, and I'm going to go into this kind of split screen mode. Here's some of the objectives for this chapter. Some of this will be pretty pertinent relative to that launch page thing that we were just talking about. All right, so we have hyperlinks, internal page links, CSS stuff, including mobile practices, looking at responsive web design, and then looking at these 2 different modern techniques for doing responsive design using a couple different tools. So one is this thing called Flexbox, and the other one is called the CSS Grid, which is kind of like a free version of Bootstrap, is kind of a way you can look at that one. All right, let's talk about the relative linking thing. And I think that, like when you're reading, you sometimes will come across terminology and you'll go like, what does this mean? So a relative link on a website is one where we're not putting the entire URL into a link. So like right here, you'll notice it just says the name of the file. Now this works great when you're in the same folder. So in other words, the file that I have on my screen wants to link to another file in the same folder. All I have to do is call it by name. So relative to where my current file exists, it's in the same folder, I just call the file. If it happens to be 1 layer deep, so in other words, they're using this as kind of an example. So in your home folder, you have your index, your contact, and your CSS. And then if I need to load images, those are in images folder. If I want to go to any of the rooms pages, those are in a separate folder, and the events pages are all in a separate folder. So if I want to go to Canyon, I first need to navigate to the rooms folder and then find the Canyon file. So this is still what we call relative linking. So relative to the index page here at the top, I have to go to this folder first, / then the file, right? So this indicates I'm going 1 folder deep. But what happens if I click on that and I end up on the Canyon page? Now I'm 1 folder deep, and I need to go back to the index page. Well, they have a special way to do that, and that is we use this ... syntax. So we say ... / that's a Unix or Linux way of saying go up a folder and then look for the file. All right? So that's how, from the Canyon page, I would get to the index page. Up a folder, find the file. But what if I'm in a folder and then want to go to a different thing in a different folder? So from the Canyon page to weekend, I would first go up one level, .. then I go into events, and then I find that file. So from here, I go up a level, find the events folder, and then into the file. So that's relative linking. That one I'm not really going to demonstrate too much, but when you get to the need to do that, and frankly, when you get to the need to do that is when you have like dozens of pages or hundreds of pages on a website that you start putting them in separate folders, because that starts to make sense. All right. The other thing that we already kind of learned, and we did this back with the HTML basics assignment, is what we call linking to fragment identifiers. In other words, placing an ID on an object. And this one that we learned back in Unit 2, right, is one that works without having the identifier. So in other words, I put in #top as my link. So if I have a really long page, I can put that at the bottom. People can click a link and jump up to the top. And this one works without the identifier. But when you're working with a really super long page, it's not a bad idea that each section or divided up content has an ID added to it. And then in order to link directly to that spot, you just add a # and then the ID name. Notice how that mimics what we do in CSS. So like when we do like selectors in CSS with an ID, that's really what we're doing here, is we're saying look for the ID named top, and when I click this link, it'll take me right to the beginning of that particular item, right? So that's called also, well, some people call that an in-page anchor, is what that means. All right, so the anchor tag. All right, so here's a kind of an interesting one. If you are on a page and you want to open a link to something that's not on your website, but you want to keep your pages open in the browser, you can use this thing where you create basically a new browser window or tab. The default these days is it creates a new tab. But you add this little tidbit, and this is one thing that I will demonstrate. So I'm going to get into coding mode here, folks. And so I'm going to do a little bit of file management. I'm going to do that externally here. So I'm going to go into my folder. I'm going to build upon my work from last week. So I'm going to right click and copy that folder, paste it back in, and rename it. And this will be Unit 6. So now I will have a fresh copy of my House of the Dragon stuff to work on. Here inside of Dreamweaver, I'm going to refresh my file and folder. I don't want to synchronize, I just want to refresh. I'm going to right click. Where's my refresh? I'm just going to collapse all these and see if it just picks up the change here. Yep, it did. So Unit 6 is in there. It automatically refreshed. All right, so there's Unit 6. There's my House of the Dragon. And this is where I'm going to start my work. I'm just going to go ahead and open up my index file, but I'm going to close my launch page for right now. Okay. Let's start with the index file and see if this is where I want to do my work. Just so that I'm remembering what I had done last time, I am going to do just a review of like the pages that I have. So here's some stuff. I have my about page where I played with the boxes, and then this page, right? So this is all the various work that I did last time. And I have to figure out like where's a good spot to test this. Now at some point, I think I had a link to an external website, and maybe I deleted that. So why don't I go ahead and add, oh, here's an external link. Okay, so here's a really good example. So here's a link to HBO Max, and when I click on it, what happens is it just opens that up basically inside the same window. I don't know if you guys caught that or not, which is great in some cases, but what if I don't want that to happen? So here's how we're going to fix it. This is on the index page, right? Or this is the dragons page. So when I go back to Dreamweaver here, I'm going to adjust this link. So this is the index page. We'll go to the dragon page. I'm going to adjust this link to HBO Max a little bit. I am going to put it on its own line here just so it's a little easier to see. But we're going to add this attribute called target, and then I want you to notice Dreamweaver shows me all the different options for this. The most commonly used one, by the way, is blank. And what that does is it opens either a new window or a new tab, and these days it's almost always a new tab. If you notice some of the other options, though, and the book does talk about these, you can go to parent, self, or top, and usually these three will end up typically in the same spot, which is back into the same window. But they do have some special connotations. Some of them work with frames, some of them don't. You know, so that's why we have all these different versions. Blank is the most common one. So let's go ahead and save this. Right, and if I go back to the browser now, this should open up a new tab instead, right? And so I think, and this is just an opinion, mind you, that when you're working with, you're pointing somebody to somebody else's website, it's not a bad idea to keep your website open, right? Because, hey, it might lead to more sales or more customers or whatever, right? So that's what Target Blank does. Good choice for external websites. Another thing to think about, and I think I showed you this the other day, is normally when we do a link, what we'll do is we'll either have some words inside the opening and closing tag or an image. That's really common. So you make an image clickable or you make some words clickable. But it is also possible to have like a whole block of HTML be a link. My favorite example of this, and I may have shown you this already, is going to like the BBC News website, where the moment I like either go to the image or the words or the title, any of those things, notice how I can hover here and the link becomes active, or I can hover over the image and the link becomes active. That's because all of this is in a combined tag like this, so you can have entire HTML structures inside here that all together act as one link. So that's something that you can do if you find it useful. Not everybody finds this useful, frankly. A couple of other interesting things that you can do with links. All right, so if you do a website where you want people to call you, right? So some people will do this for businesses. For example, let's say you own a pizza place and you want somebody to call in an order, right? You might actually provide a link that has one of these prefixes, either TEL with a colon or SMS with a colon. So the TEL obviously is for a phone call. So that would initiate, particularly on mobile, it would launch your phone with the number preloaded. You just hit dial, or the call button. Or you can do the SMS, and by the way, that's a text. That's what SMS stands for. And then it brings up your texting app. Now these can work on a computer also, but they really are more mobile centric. So if you wanted to add these, pretty easy to do. The one thing that we have that's kind of similar right now is if you look at, in our footer, we did a mail to, right? And so what does that do? It brings up your mail client. If I switch this to a phone call, or I say tell, it will bring up your phone client. Now I am on a computer. I do have an app that does phone calls on here, but it's kind of private, so I don't really want to bring it on screen and show my phone number and my text messages and stuff. But I could replace that with tell or SMS, and it can launch that. So pretty useful. Once again, I think if you're running a business and you want people to call and text you, especially on mobile, that you add that as a thing. So for example, one thing I could do here is I could add a paragraph saying, feel free to call, and then I could put in my link, and I could say tell, and then I like, they use like the Hollywood thing, 555, 555, 555, right? They do fives. And then I think it's polite to also right? And if I wanted to make this an SMS, I could just, for example, copy that, paste it, and just say text, and then just change this to SMS. And here maybe you actually want to say, well, the text is there, so let's just save it and pull it up. And then if you try this on your phone, by the way, those should ring those services. So it'll either bring up your text app or your calling app, and it will launch. I think those are kind of neat. Like I said, particularly useful in a number of ways. We had talked about this a little bit in a chapter or two ago. We talked about what CSS sprites are. And I think I showed you examples of sprite sheets, where it's like lots of little images in one image, and then you use the same image basically to populate, or different parts of that same image to populate something on a page. They're doing a little bit of an example of it here. I don't consider this a really important thing to focus on right now, but if you are dealing with lots of little icon images, a CSS sprite is something you want to look into, not something that's really critical for our class. All right. In the previous chapter actually, we started looking at how you can achieve different layouts for pages, right? And as we kind of move through each chapter now, they're going to show you different layouts and what or how you might use this. So in this example here, they're doing a 3-column page layout, headers across the top, navigations on the side, kind of the center content area with a footer, and then we have what we call an aside, which has a couple little blurbs in it. And so this format can be achieved a number of different ways. So like first you have to start with your basic HTML structures. So you would basically make sure that your HTML is structured in this way. So you have probably header comes first in your HTML, nav comes second, main is structured. Notice the footer is inside the main, and then you create an aside tag with a couple of news articles or sections or articles. It might be a better tag for this that sits inside of aside, and those would be in order in your HTML. And then in order to style these, they give you some generic styling tips, right? So just for example, you could get this layout by floating the nav to the left, giving it a width, floating the aside to the right, giving that a width, and then using a center column with margins. And notice the margins are a little bit different than the floats, so this will slide into the middle, and then in the footer you do a clear so that everything sits correctly on the page, and then you get this look. So there's, like, if that's a kind of look you want to go for, there's an example. Now I will say that you could still do this and put your navigation at the top and then use the left sidebar for something other than navigation, but they're showing one here with navigation. So if you're shooting for a 3-column layout, here's an example. Another thing that's kind of interesting, and I think this is weird, right? Because you might not see the usage of this initially, but when we do CSS, we usually think about putting stuff on the screen and making it look nice, right? And when you're doing that, generally speaking, if you look at the CSS links that we've put in our documents right now, so for example, if I come in here, I basically just have the relationship, which is it's a style sheet, and then the link to it. There is also kind of an additional parameter that we don't usually add, which is the type. It's considered more proper in older XHTML, but you say type is text CSS. And so some people add that. I'm going to still say that's pretty optional. Really, the relationship one's pretty optional too, honestly. But then you have this other attribute that you can add here, which is what the target media is. And this is, I think, pretty interesting because we assume it's going to a computer screen or, okay, a phone screen, one or the other, right? But they're screens, right? It is possible, though, to actually do CSS for printed documents. So, for example, you might go to a web page and then it might have a little thing that says, click here to print this, right? And it doesn't bring up the print dialog. What it does is it sometimes takes you to a separate page or triggers the print command with a separate set of CSS just for print media. And if you do that, there's some tricks that they recommend. One thing is, for example, let's say like you have a website and you got the content, but you have a sidebar and it's got an ad, and somebody wants to print this because they want the content, they don't want the ads. You can actually, when they hit the print button, tell the navigation to go away, or the ads to go away, or the parts of the screen they don't really need to not show, basically. They also recommend that you switch from pixels to point for font sizes. So instead of like a 16 pixel font, you would say a 12 point font, and then use dark text colors. So black ink on white pages looks wonderful, so that's what you should do. So don't, like, if your text is like blue or something, it might not print that well. That's the point. You can also do page breaks, which you can always stick in there, and then you can also, if it's helpful, use this little CSS trick here, kind of an advanced CSS trick, but allows you to print the URLs for hyperlinks. So if a page says click here to go to HBO Max, this little command here will actually show the URL in the printed document, right? So if somebody's got a printed document, they want to go to the link, they can't see the code behind the link, but this would allow it to show. Right? So kind of a weird thing to do. I used to use separate CSS style sheets. I used to do like a lot of e-commerce sites, and then it dawned on me, it's like, well, some people who are looking at this stuff might want to print it on paper so they can show it to somebody else that maybe doesn't have internet, and so I would have people print like catalog pages, and I would write separate CSS just for those catalog pages. All right. Next thing that we start to think about, as we do our designing is, most of surfing happens on mobile devices these days. So we have some considerations that we have to think about when working with mobile that affect what we're doing as coders. And the first thing is that, well, a phone's got a smaller screen size, right? And most people don't, like we're on a computer screen, we are wide, not tall. On a mobile, most people hold it in their hand like they hold their hand, which is tall and not wide. And so we have to think about that as we lay out the screen. So what happens is we look at it a different way. Here's some of the limitations. They also say like low bandwidth. Maybe you don't have all the fonts and colors that you have on regular devices. I think this has kind of been overcome now. Awkward controls, well, it depends. For older person like me, awkward. For a younger person like you guys, probably not so much. Lack of flash support, really this should just be crossed out at this point. Flash has really gone away. And often we have devices that have limited capability. And then we also have the fact that, like, when you're pushing content to a phone, people are paying for their bandwidth. So if you send them too much stuff, you're chewing up their bandwidth, and they might not want to come back to your site. So make your pages really efficient. They do have a couple of like links here, and I want you to notice how dated some of this stuff is. But they do have some things that they recommend that you do differently on a phone. So in other words, it might make more sense to optimize your navigation for a phone. And what a lot of people do these days is they either stack their navigation or they give you what we call the hamburger menu, which is those three little lines that you click on, and then a menu pops up so you can get to the other stuff. That's really, really common. You want to think about how the layout, on a phone, if it's upright, it makes more sense for you to use a single column, top to bottom kind of layout. Once again, the nav could be as shown or collapse to a hamburger menu that expands, but we usually keep a really simple type of thing here. We don't want people to have to scroll to the left and right, typically on a phone, just up and down, because that's what they're used to. And then they have some examples here for things that are good practices. So they say, avoid using pixel units and style sheets and use more relative sizing like M's and percentages. I think that's pretty good advice, although sometimes you do have to use pixels for mobile too. Don't do any absolute positioning on mobile sites. In fact, try to avoid that in general is a good tip. And then when you're switching to this mode, there's some content that you might want to hide. So if you had a 3-column layout, you might want to hide columns 2 or 3 when you're on a mobile and you're upright. Generally speaking, don't give too much navigation for mobile. So if you're on your regular website and you got like 20 menu items across the top, and some of those have drop downs and expanders and stuff, don't do that to your mobile users. It becomes a real pain to navigate. Keep it simple, and try not to give people like pop-ups and too much stuff on the screen. I mean, so like when you're on mobile, you have to think about the fact that mobile is smaller. So what might look good on a big screen might need a different approach on a little screen. Like, for example, making your fonts bigger on a mobile is one thing. You also want to change the graphics. So like on a big screen, I might have a picture of my vacation, which is like a bigger, higher res image, but on a mobile, I might want a really small image, or one that looks better on a phone. So some helpful tips here for working with images. The other thing that you want to also think about is like how you put the words on a page. Once again, high contrast is really good on a phone, because think about this: if your battery's low and you got the screen dimmed down, do you want people to struggle to see the words, if it's dim? So make sure that you use high contrast with words in particular. And use fonts that work well, generally speaking. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is as you start working with mobile, and this will be one of your case study things to do for this chapter, is they start having you think about what we call what's the initial scale of your page when you land on it. And so normally, like if you were on a regular screen and you brought up like your home page, it might look like this, right? And then when you load it up on a mobile, it'll end up looking like this. So some of the content is cut off. You're not seeing the sidebar stuff. The header doesn't populate correctly. And so what they do is they have this meta tag, which basically takes the zoom level of your page and resets it to 100%, so that when people land on the page, they get the whole website as opposed to a portion of it if you're zoomed in. I don't know if that really resonates with you real strongly right now, but this is kind of considered a mobile necessity in a lot of cases. They just make you reset to 100%, and then if people need to zoom in, they can pinch and zoom if they want, but to start with, we're at 100%. Another thing that starts to happen is we start to use this thing called media queries, and media queries becomes really important from the standpoint that when we are working with CSS, we have the capability to redraw the CSS depending on the kind of screen or device that's looking at the screen and its resolution. So for example, if I'm on a screen like I am right now, which is 1920 pixels across, getting the stuff on a screen is not a problem. But if I'm in a mobile and when I hold it upright, my resolutions may be less than 500 pixels, and they're alluding to that here. 480 pixels is kind of a common threshold for mobile in an upright mode. You might be missing some of the content. So what you can do is you add this thing called media queries, where you can have a separate style sheet completely load up based on your screen width. I'm not a big fan of that approach. I don't see a lot of people using this. So in other words, they would have basically a separate CSS page if you were looking at the site with your phone upright like this, and it goes, oh, this is a phone, it's upright, let's load this CSS instead, and then you have a completely separate style sheet. That's not a really popular approach. The more popular approach is to do this, which is to add this to your CSS, and then basically you set up a whole separate set of styles inside of this set of curly brackets that responds to the screen width. So in other words, let me show you an example of this in working order here, and I know I've shown you this site here before, which is the Boston Globe site, famous one for doing this, by the way. And their whole thing was how you would transition down, right? And you can see as the content starts to shift and change sizes, like here we went from 3 columns to 2. It's because we reached a threshold in size, probably right around 1,000 pixels is my guess here, maybe a little less. And then as we drop down, then second column goes away and the ads go away and a lot of the images go away, and we're in single column view. The menu collapses down to a hamburger thing. And so that's all done with a thing called media queries. And so what we do in our code is we set up these little blocks here. So we say that when it reaches a maximum width of 768 pixels, use this CSS. And once again, you can turn things on and off, change your sizes, your font sizes, colors, all that stuff can be changed. And then as you start to work with different screen sizes, you can actually accommodate, so phone, tablet, and computer. And each one of those can have their own media queries. Media queries can be pretty touchy, right? So you have to use your inspect tool pretty heavily to work with media queries to adjust them correctly. And frankly, it can be maybe a little bit beyond the scope of what we need for this class in terms of a project, but it becomes really important when you're working on certain aspects of a website and you want it to behave correctly as screen sizes change. Media queries sometimes do have to be manually controlled to get them quite right? And you can put in as many as you want, but people usually use pretty common thresholds. The two that you see here, like 480 and 768, are pretty close to standard. Although some people will take the 768 one and bump it up to 900 or 1,000, somewhere around there. And then sometimes 480 goes a little higher. It just depends. Another little issue that you run into, and what they're trying to do here is use an example of working with an image in all 3 of these formats. So somebody looks at your site and they're either bringing it up on a phone, a tablet, or a computer, and then you have media queries set up to kind of collapse down your content. You go 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns, for example, but that image at the top, you want it to go all the way across in all the formats. Well, you can do this thing where you say max width 100%, and it's 100% of what? Well, whatever object it's inside of, right? So in this case, if this is inside of the header, which is 80% of the width of the screen, it's 100% of that size. Here, where the whole page is 100% of the screen and only 2 columns, once again it goes all the way across, and then on mobile. So this is kind of an interesting little trick to accomplish that effect, and they're giving you the code for it. So that's one that you can play with as well. All right, this is kind of interesting, and I want you to notice here they say HTML 5.1, and really this is draft of version 6. So they are working on HTML 6 right now. But here is kind of an interesting new tag. This is a brand new tag. It does work currently in HTML5 if you want to experiment with it. I would not call it required. But what they're doing with this one is they're recognizing the fact that people look at stuff on different size screens, and what they're trying to do is give you the standard way of putting in the image, right? So they have the standard image, source, and an alt tag. And then they're determining here that, well, why don't we look at the person's screen width, so we can look at the media, look at the minimum width of the screen, and then depending on what the screen width is, if it's at least 1,200 pixels wide, load the big one. If it's only 800 pixels wide, load the medium one. And if it's 320 or more, load the small image. And if none of those work, because this is a new HTML tag, your browser might not support it, then we'll just load the image tag, the regular one, whatever that is. So you would have to kind of determine that. This really, I think, is a pretty cool technique. And once again, this is a draft version of what's coming down the line. Now, as often happens with draft versions of HTML code, we don't know if this is going to be official ultimately. It does work right now, but they also have this other technique, so I want you to notice the difference between these. they're basically doing the same thing. Is they're using the image tag, and then they have what we call sizes, and they're using these things that are view windows, what this stands for. And so they're saying here, here's the image for this window, here's the image for that window, here's the image for that window, and here's the alt tag. And that basically works the same as this one, and I don't know which one they're going to settle on for HTML6, but they're going to choose one or the other, and the other one's going to go away. But I think it's kind of interesting because HTML is an evolving language, so as they come out with one version, they're already working on the next. And so kind of interesting. I wouldn't call each one of these techniques necessary to add to any of your sites right now. Now, one thing that you can do, and this is kind of weird, is if you are designing for mobile, you can test for mobile by using a bunch of different tools. Frankly, my favorite way to do this is a really simplistic one, and that is to just do what I did before, is I just make the screen really narrow, and that behaves how mobile does often, right? However, if I come to my page and I right-click and do an inspect, there's also built into the tool here, and I want you to notice this icon, right? And it says toggle device toolbar. So I'm going to click this, and then it switches modes for me, and then I can toggle. This is Chrome, by the way, that I'm using. Actual brand name. So if I want to see what it looks like on an iPhone 12 Pro, there it is. If I want to see what it looks like on a Samsung Galaxy A51, I'm not sure what that is, but there it is. And here's what's kind of interesting. You notice how you can pick all the different devices. You can also edit that list, and you can add a bunch of stuff that's not on the list right now. So you notice that, like, this has, for example, a bunch of different stuff. And as you start to play with this, right, so like which devices you're putting up there to look at, you can also play with some other things. So like one thing that you can do is you can also control how much bandwidth the phone is getting, so you can simulate a slow connection, for example, or from a different location, like a different country or region. But I think this is a pretty interesting little panel. All the major browsers have a panel like this, and you know, it comes with a little bit of playing. I'm going to turn that off, so it just goes to regular mode. I think the Firefox tool is maybe a little bit better than this one, by the way, and I typically always say that because it's true. But there are some other outside tools. So like the Apple operating system has built into it a simulator tool to simulate iPhone, which you can look at your web pages in if you want. And there's also third-party pieces of software. But I'm a big fan of just using a desktop browser to do this. And the other thing that you can do is you can actually run emulators. So this is kind of interesting because as you guys move forward in your degree and you get to the latter part of the degree, we do have an Android class that we offer where you do actually run Android Studio, which has an Android emulator built into it, so you can see what stuff looks like on mobile because it's emulating it. There are other, ways to do this, a number of different ways, but one thing you can always do is you can just simply upload your stuff to Prometheus and then look at it on your phone. That's one way to do it. That's really kind of simple and practical, and we have that capability. And if you have not done that with any of your pages yet, you should look. When we get to that final project, I will be looking at how stuff looks on mobile. I'm not super concerned with it yet, but it is important. All right. Now, the other thing, and there's kind of a couple of resources here that I want to talk about, and the first thing is that people have recognized that mobile has become primary, that all HTML that we create doesn't optimally work for mobile automatically, and so they came up with a new way to put content on a screen that is automatically responsive, and this technique is known as Flexbox. And I'm going to actually pop us over to W3 Schools to take a look at this. So I'm going to go to, and I don't know if this is under HTML or CSS. I'm assuming it's under HTML, but here we can always do a search here, Flexbox. Let's see if we can find it faster this way. All right, so it is under CSS. So here's that. Okay, so this is actually an art. I just want to go to their content. Okay, so that was not very useful. So let's just go to CSS and find Flexbox. It'll probably be towards the bottom here somewhere. If somebody sees it before I do. Here it is, way at the bottom. Right. And so what a Flexbox does is it basically allows you to set up like divs. They're using divs as the example here, but basically like various boxes. So let's just try this yourself. And what ends up happening is, you know, the container, and this is not really a good example, is set up to automatically adjust to the sizes here. And you'll notice that they'll have the CSS that comes with this. Now, this is not, once again, super critical on any of the homework that we're going to do, but you will notice in the unit folder, there's an extra credit assignment for taking whatever website that you're building and switching it to a Flexbox design. When you do Flexbox, there's a whole bunch of little considerations here. In the old days, we would worry about it working with all the browsers. I will tell you it works fine with all the browsers, so you don't need to do any of this prefix stuff. But the long and the short of it is really that you can take a site like this, set up like a multi-column layout, and then have it automatically adjust as you make the screen bigger, so they'll stay relative size to each other. And what you're really doing is, like, you're saying that I've got 10 columns, so it's like 1 plus 7 plus 2 equals 10. So I actually have 10 columns here. The main box in the middle occupies 7 of them, the aside occupies 2, and the nav occupies 1. And as I change my screen size, those proportions are maintained. That's really what Flexbox does. So that can be really, really helpful for your designs. Another approach to doing responsive design is to use what we call the CSS grid. Now, this is kind of a new thing. Once again, if you go to W3, and let's go here, and I assume that they're going to do this here, right? So they have CSS, a whole section on CSS grid. And the whole point of the CSS grid is that you can do like these weird layouts. And once again, it automatically responds to mobile views and different screen sizes. And basically what you do is you set up, you know, little areas of the screen, you list them as grid items, and then you can apply basically a series of built-in styles to control the appearance of this. Now, for those of you that are interested in, you know, proceeding with something like this, I would say this is maybe a little beyond the scope of this class, but I'm presenting it to you. This is an open source version of what a lot of others professionally use, which is called Bootstrap. And this is basically a pre-built library you can use for free, where basically you add code to any of your stuff on the page, which makes it look a certain way without you having to basically write any code. You know, so basically the CSS is all pre-built, and you're saying, hey, I want this to be a 3-column thing, and you just say, you just put in the right CSS code, and boom, it's a 3-column thing. You don't even have to type it in, and that's Bootstrap. Really so popular, you guys, that it's built in to a lot of products. Like, for example, if I go to Dreamweaver and I create a new web page, I can say HTML, and I just want you to notice that Bootstrap's already attached. Or, you know, so I can just say create new, or I can attach custom CSS or whatever, but it's just a given, you know. And if you use high-end products, so for example, WebStorm, PHPStorm, Dreamweaver, Visual Studio, the full product, the Bootstrap's just built in. It's a checkbox and it's there, right? And the beauty of that is typography, layout, responsiveness, all those things are kind of automatically controlled by the template. Once again, I consider this kind of an advanced skill. That's not necessary really at this point, but I do want to expose you to it so you understand that it's out there. And so if you keep, like, thinking in your mind, is there, oh my God, is there an easier way to do this and make it all work? Easier is a relative term, right? Because you have to learn about the whole thing. But what this does is it basically sets up your site like in a grid like this, and then the grids will dynamically adjust provided you put in the right code. So you can control the code. And so that's kind of one of these really helpful little things that as you move into the future you might experiment with. What CSS Grid is a W3 product that is meant to be like kind of like a free version of Bootstrap, but most pros will go to Bootstrap directly and kind of skip this. Is CSS Grid and Bootstrap the only things out there? No, there's a bunch of different tools out there. Another real popular one that I used to use way back when was called 960 Grid. So that's another one of these things that kind of automatically makes websites. Here's examples of work done in it, right? And you can see these things and go, oh, so that's how they did it, right? So it's not like somebody sat there and coded out all the CSS and got it perfect. They just use a grid system, dropped in a couple of codes, and it just looks like this. So that's something that you look at down the future, or down the road in the future for getting your work done, is that CSS Grid thing. So kind of cool, for sure. As we kind of get to the end of the chapter here, a lot of the work that you're going to do, you're going to notice now you're going to have this shift where you're not going to worry as much about your HTML as you are about your CSS, and maybe that's already happened to you. But whenever you're working with CSS, always remember there is a validator. It does not take much of an error to break a page. Vidal, when you and I were working with Alex the other day, I think Alex in one spot was just missing one semicolon, like in his CSS. So for example, right, if you're in your CSS file and let's say I forget this semicolon, well, guess what happens? Everything that follows breaks, and in some cases can break the whole document. That's a real big thing. Another thing that I see is a really common error with CSS issues is somebody will be playing with some setting. So let's say you're playing with the width 70%, and then you're like, I don't like that width, I'm going to try another width. And you type width colon 90%. Okay, which one of these two is going to stick? Okay, here's the answer. It's going to read the first one and then do it, and then keep moving, and then it's going to read the second one and then do that. So it's the second one that always counts. So if you have conflicting styles, the second one is the one that reads. Try not to have conflicting styles is really kind of the answer here. Make sure that you have those semicolons at the end and you're following proper formatting. A real big tip also is, here's the point in the class where you might want to consider switching to a higher end tool aside from the ones you're using currently. So what I'm going to kind of add to the tail end of this presentation is some of the other tools you might want to consider using. And I know you guys are watching me use Dreamweaver, and some of you are like, well, yeah, that's great, I can do a trial version, but that only lasts 30 days. Well, then what, right? And all the cool tools cost money, it seems. But I'm going to show you that that's actually not true. There's tools that you can use, for free. And some of them are really, really good tools, by the way. All right, so the tips, once again, check for syntax errors, use the validator. But you can also do a manual perusal like I was doing, and you see how like a tool like this, when I break something, how it like changes the coloring and puts little things in the margin to show you, or underlines it in red or highlights it somehow. Those I think are very helpful. Whenever you're trying to see how stuff sits on a page, it's not a bad idea, and I do this a lot. I'll put like either a background color on something or borders on something, so I can just see how it sits on the page, and then I know what space it's occupying. Don't forget about the inspect tool either, right? So if like I'm in, and in this case I'm in Firefox here, and I right click and inspect, that I have this capability, especially with this little arrow tool, to kind of find the objects, see what space they actually occupy on the screen very specifically. And I think this tool, the inspect tool, is a huge one for getting stuff right. As you start to make changes in your CSS, so for example, let's say I'm working on, let's find somewhere where there's like a color or something here. All right, so here's like a color, for example, and I'm playing with different colors. What I might do is I might, like, say, tried, brown, didn't look good, or something like that. Or if I tried like a certain hex code, for example, I might like notate that here, just so if I want to switch back to it, I know. Or like what I often used to do is I'd put in notes like this to myself: check this. Is it messed up? Or maybe something like, fix this, something like that. So I leave notes for myself, or if I don't like how something worked out, I may just block out a whole bunch of code, disable it, but not delete it. That way, if I want to go back to it, I can, right? So you see the logic of that. So I think that's a pretty useful tip. Often, if I would be working on a CSS file that gets really huge, we haven't done a lot of work, but this is already like over 100 lines. And when I say huge, I'm talking about thousands of lines of CSS code. I sometimes do this little stuff where I put my like initials in, for example, or edit or something like that. And that way I can use the find feature inside my editor, usually Control F. So here's my find feature in Dreamweaver. And then I'm looking for TK edit, and it finds it. Right, every spot that I listed like that, I can go through and find my notes. So just a helpful bunch of suggestions that way. All right, so that pretty much wraps the PowerPoint for this chapter. And I do want to kind of just jump back to the core shell really quick, and then we're going to take another break as soon as we finish this little bit. And I want to have you learn a little bit about IDEs, basically. And IDEs, are the tools that we use to build code. From a real basic standpoint, I introduced you first to something other than like the Windows editor, and that was the product Notepad++, right? So, and this allows you to code in HTML. A lot of you, if you weren't using this tool, may have opted for Visual Studio Code, right? We've taken a couple looks at this, and once again, not a bad tool, maybe a little bit better than Notepad++. It's highly subjective, mind you, but a better quality tool. Lots of third-party plugins and stuff to make it pretty usable. All right, so I've already pushed Dreamweaver on you. That comes from Adobe. That costs money. It's a trial, but you know what? Adobe was pretty wise. They actually came up with a free version of Dreamweaver, so this might pique some people's interests. And that product was called Brackets. So if you go to brackets.io, and here, I'll just drop that in the chat really quick. So, oops, apparently it did not copy. Let me try that one more time. There's the link to it. And this is really kind of an interesting tool because this was the free version of Dreamweaver, basically. And for a while, it was managed by Adobe. So in other words, Adobe was building Dreamweaver, and then they also had this product called Brackets that they also managed that was free for everybody. They gave up control of the product eventually, and now it's managed by this other group. But the editor is still here. So Brackets is another one of these rich text editors, and it is really a cool product. I'm not sure that I have it installed, but I guess I do. If you want to try a HTML editor that doesn't cost anything, that's maybe a little bit more powerful than your standard editor. So it does like autocomplete, color selection, live updated the browser, this is really a pretty highly recommended product. I'm going to actually open up some stuff here. Oops, this is Apollo. We want to go to Prometheus. Right, so here's, this is last week's work. Let's go to this week's work. So here's the editor opening up the stuff I'm currently working on. So here's all my files, and I'll just go ahead and open up the index page here. So here's the code. And so you can see a pretty clean look, right? But here's, to me, the killer tool of this is this little lightning bolt thing. When you click on it, all right, it opens up the browser and gives you a live view of the website. So if, just for example, watch the House of the Dragons logo here. I can actually come House of the Dragons, right? So I can just type, and you can see the results immediately on your page, which is kind of neat. If you're writing code, for example, and I'm just going to kind of lamely add a style command here and say style equals, and then type color. Notice how it brings up the same panel that Dreamweaver has, right? So you can like pick colors by name, just for example. So it has a bunch of really cool features like that. I really like this product a lot. I'm not sure a lot of professionals use it, but if you like some of those automatic features, this is a really killer product. So this is called Brackets. Another one that I think is really useful, and I'm going to show you actually a suite of products here. There's a company called JetBrains, and I'm just going to bring up the URL here. I'm going to drop that in the chat once again. And I'm going to give you a tip about JetBrains. So JetBrains is a company that develops a lot of different coding tools for a lot of different languages. Their big product is called IntelliJ. That's like their grand, it's kind of like Visual Studio. It's like the big product. But I want you to notice all the different things that they have here for a lot of different platforms. The ones that are particular interest to web developers, by the way, would be PHP Storm and WebStorm. WebStorm's designed for JavaScript and HTML and CSS, and PHP does all those things plus the PHP language. And chances are, when you take your PHP class here at Gateway, that your instructor, usually Wendy, usually might recommend that you download and install this product. If you're curious about these products, I don't know if I have any of them installed here on my machine, and I guess I have to kind of, no, I do not. Okay, so I don't have either one installed. I might actually have IntelliJ, now that I think about it. No, I don't have that installed. Not on this machine. On my school machine, I do. But these products, have kind of like more of a modern look, and they have a bunch of tools built in, including FTP is built right into these products, and really sophisticated autocomplete and correction features are built into these as well. If you're interested in these, there is a way, as these are paid products, to get it for free. So this is the technique for getting it for free, by the way. Go to their website, do a search, type education or student or one of those two things, and you'll get to this link. JetBrains for education, right? And then what you do, right, so you get free access to professional tools, is you sign up for a student account. And I'm not sure, just click on this here, free educational licenses for students and teachers, and apply first. So don't download, install the product, and then try to get the license. Get the free account first, and then after you have the free account, then you can come in, sign into the website, and download anything here you want for free and use it for free as long as you're a student. They might make you renew it once every year or so, something like that, but really cool products. Once again, highly recommended. I think, I'm fairly certain, like if you take certain classes with either Christian or Wendy, they will typically have you install this. So when you do the JavaScript class, for example, this might be your favorite IDE because it really is built to do JavaScript, you know. But you can write regular web code in it too. Very cool, very, very cool product. Are there other editors that you can use? Yeah, probably one of the ones that we have talked about the least here is Microsoft's Visual Studio, which is the full-blown product. Not Visual Studio Code, but Visual Studio without the code at the end. And when you go here, this is available also for free. There's a community version, but this is what we call this is like the Mercedes-Benz of IDEs or whatever. It's like the top of the hill. It does like everything. You can do web pages. You can code in just about any language. And it's super, super powerful, but also a huge download. So if you do the whole product, it's over 100 gigabytes of disk space to install it, and that's not what you want. But you can download the community version, and you can just work with HTML and JavaScript components, for example. It has beautiful autocomplete. Bootstrap is built in. File transfer tools are built in. Database tools are built in. It's like, you know, it is the tool, you know, in many ways, especially if you're working in a Microsoft world. Highly recommended. You will notice that it also has a Mac version, and all the web stuff does work for Mac just fine for the most part. Not everything, but for the most part. That's why I say it like that. And then Visual Studio Code is what their true cross-platform tool, but is not nearly as powerful as regular Visual Studio. Do I think this is a necessary tool at this point? I'm going to say no, right? But when you take the ASP.NET class, typically I'm the one teaching that. That's a required piece of software because it's the only way to do .NET, you know, and that's kind of a whole different web framework. All right, folks, that kind of wraps up my whole talk about IDEs. And then I have a couple of extra things down here about like the developer tools, which includes the inspect windows and kind of the talk similar to what I just did in video format down here. This recording ends here.